One of the programs I supervise is Slavic and East European Studies. And this year, Dr. Heron, who's lurking behind me, this is so familiar, it's like a debate or something. Dr. Eric Heron, who is in the political science department, and I cooked up this idea to commemorate the 1917 Russian revolutions. But we wanted to expand the idea of what the 1917 Russian revolutions meant. So Professor Tauger last week gave us a great lecture on the revolutions themselves. But now we're going to sort of blow up our concept of this. And we're talking about the revolutionary world and different kinds of revolution and stretching it to 2017. In particular, tonight we have a lecture that brings us to the present day. And part of this is also recruitment, putting out the word about the Slavic and East European Studies program. So we're going to have a program pretty much for the rest of the semester. We've got some great ones next week. We've got Russian avant-garde art back here in this room, same time, same place. Wednesday, in 10 days, we've got interwar fascism and anti-Semitism. And then Denise Jardina, who's a fantastic West Virginia writer, will be talking about the socialist revolution in West Virginia and what happened, right? You're thinking, what socialist revolution in West Virginia? So you'll have to come and find out. And then toward the end of the semester, we will have Professor Beth Holmgren from Duke University, who will be talking to us about the sexual revolution in Poland and Russia. And it's going to be comrades and flappers. And so at each one of our events, you get to collect one of these dope-ass buttons. And so what you want to do, obviously, is catch them all, right, Pokey Kids? So I will pass it on to Professor Heron, but thank you all for being here. Please make sure you signed in whether you're here for extra credit or not. We like to keep track of who comes to our events so that we can justify having more events. So Professor Heron, take it away.
Thank you, Lisa, and thanks to everyone for coming. You're in for a real treat today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Cindy Buckley. Dr. Buckley comes to us from University of Illinois, where she's a professor of sociology. She has traveled extensively in the post-Soviet region and the post-communist region. So from Poland and Hungary in the west to Mongolia, China, Afghanistan in the east, and everywhere in between. She has done field work and published on health, on gender, on aging, on migration, and on many other things. She has served as an advisor to and a consultant for non-governmental organizations and governmental organizations. She was on the Obama-Medvedev commissions on higher education and on migration. She is an award-winning teacher and researcher. She does incredible service in her field of sociology and in the study of the post-communist region in general. And like I said, it's really my pleasure to welcome Cindy here, and please join me in welcoming Cindy. She's going to give a talk on the anti-LGBT agenda in Russia. So thank you.
It's always rough getting a good intro because then it's like, wow, I am set up to fail now. Okay, thank you all for coming, and I'd also really like to thank Lisa because you gave me this much better title that's much more fun than the original title that I was talking about. But what we're really talking about here is, again, kind of a link in with Beth Holmgren's work, which is about sexual revolution, but also the revolution of public opinion. And when we think about revolutions and we think about the great theories of revolution, a lot of revolutions come from the bottom up. Others, am I not?
I don't think you're on. Yeah. Is it turned on? There?
It's lit.
You're on now, I think, now.
Okay, you want to test
Oh, it's past 4:20, isn't it? Okay. Sorry.
Talk for a minute and just see.
Hunter.
Still not.
This one's
I can put my teaching voice on.
Is that better?
Hello, Hunter.
There.
I think that did it. Okay. Please excuse me for that. And if you didn't get the 420 joke, ask the person next to you. Okay. All right. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a precursor to some of the things that Beth Holmgren will talk about in terms of the sexual revolution. We talked about revolutions coming from the bottom up. A lot of revolutions seem to come from the top down in ways in which those in power try to push a specific agenda on a population that maybe has a low approval rating of that leader. But nonetheless, those are some of the ways in which revolutions occur. I'm going to talk about everybody's favorite subject on Thursday afternoon, which is sex and sexuality, and talk a little bit about how this has both challenged and vexed Russian leaders from the imperial period up until the current period. So I've got 3 big points I want to make here. We're going to talk about kind of exploring what's the history, where do these ideas about what's proper sex and what's improper sex and who's a sexual minority and who isn't, where did that come from and how did that history come into being in the Russian Federation. I also want to talk a little bit about agents, not just in the Russian Federation, but in a lot of countries that have tried to push homophobia from above to set certain socio-political agendas. And then thirdly, I want to talk a little bit about something that people don't talk about very much, which is how opinions vary, right? What happens at the micro level? It's not that all Russians are homophobic. It's not that all people in red states are homophobic. There's variation, and things vary systematically by gender, by age, by education. And not very many analyses have been done in the Russian Federation that kind of break it down and say, okay, who is susceptible to these messages from above that are trying to stigmatize sexual minorities in the Russian Federation? And then to think a little bit about how that might compare with experiences in other countries. So to both look at the unique elements of the Russian Federation, but also to bring it into comparative frameworks. So, as most of you know, in 2013, it was not necessarily a banner year for human rights in the Russian Federation. A law was passed that levied a fine for, quote, homosexual propaganda. This was the idea that anything that mentioned alternative sexual orientations, any displays of same-sex affection, any sorts of NGOs, any sorts of articles, any sorts of websites with information for teens who were curious or perhaps were trying to explore their own sexual orientation. All of this kind of was folded in under the banner term of propaganda. And this law came in with full force. Everyone in the Duma voted for this law. And it was rapidly signed by President Putin in a very big signing ceremony, right, where he gave the pen out and picked it up and showed it around. So I think there's a little cultural crossover that may seem resonant with those of you who've been watching American TV. The law is pretty stringent. It gives a monetary fine as well as jail time for people who are convicted of spreading propaganda. Over the next year and a half, over the next 18 months, this law was expanded. If you are in any way involved in education and you are found guilty of this law, you cannot keep your job. Not only are you fired, but you are banned from teaching in any school after that. And we'll get to why this has been morphed into this, oh, we must protect our children thing in a moment. More importantly, it's the idea that lawmakers, and this should concern all of us, lawmakers interpreted this in the following 18 months is that actually anything that would advocate sex that didn't end in procreation was punishable. Yeah, that'll put a damper on your weekend, won't it? Okay. Now for me, this is where all of a sudden I jump up from my overstuffed office and start thinking about this very seriously because I work on HIV and AIDS. And we have just been trying to increase condom use in the Russian Federation. And several members of the Duma wanted to codify this law so that using a condom was actually a punishable offense because that would close you off to procreation. Not a happy time for human rights advocates in the Russian Federation, to be sure. And indeed, this sparked global outcry. Famous actors and actresses going through Russia had to get on Red Square and with their rainbow flags. And then they had to be whisked away very quickly because if they were out too long, they would get arrested.
So that is Tilda Swinton.
Tilda Swinton.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. No, it's not Bob Dylan. It's the other one. Okay, they look a lot alike, right? Okay. Right around 2013, it kind of culminated in what had been a historicized and horrifying rise in violent attacks against anyone involved with NGO communities that were advocating for the rights of sexual minorities, anyone associated with the LGBTQ community parade events in either Moscow or St. Petersburg. Very bloody beatings taking place with police then charging the victim for clearly advocating same-sex relationships under the propaganda law while their attackers went free. And here we see Kirill Filipov, who's one of the major LGBTQ advocates in Russia, and was walking down the street and not doing anything, and someone came up and beat him bloody, and the judge made this decision. You are known in the press as someone who advocates for LGBTQ rights. The act of you walking down the street is propaganda. So things have gotten quite bad. And it leads us to some interesting questions, I think. The first one is about historical legacies. Stuff like this just doesn't crop up out of nowhere, right? What are the structural, sort of historical influences that got Russia to this point? And secondly, how does this frame kind of fold into ideas of human rights, both in the West as well as in Russia? How is this being thought about? What do these restrictions mean? Is this talked about in the same kind of language in East and West? And then finally, how does this message from above play out in the population? We know the police are set to follow the interpretations of the government in terms of enforcing the anti-propaganda law, but what about public opinion, right? Who's for it? Who's against it? How does this differ by education level? How does this differ by the age of the people being asked? And how does that help us think about Russia kind of in the context of a global shift towards greater respect for sexual minority rights? So let's talk about history, and boy, Russia's got quite a lot of it, right? And homophobia is nothing new. It's old as the Russian Empire. Many of the historical documents we have from, say, the 1600s really focus on the church being very active in terms of punishment for people who are engaged in same-sex behavior. Not surprisingly, most of the historical record of this era focuses on men who have sex with men, primarily because nobody wrote about women. It didn't really matter what they were doing. They don't really appear in a lot of the archives. But the church has a very, very intolerant view towards same-sex relationships. In 1716, Peter the Great, right? He puts in the first, military ban on MSMs. He's going to get rid of all individuals interested in same-sex relationships from the Navy. This is where he starts, and then he puts it through the Army and the rest of the armed forces. Tsar Nicholas later enacts what we call Article 995. And Article 995 basically made any sort of sex between two men broadly defined, not a Clintonian, a punishable offense. What was the punishment? Send them to Siberia. So a fairly gruesome period. As the century turns, Tolstoy, who really has the Russian spirit and is one of their great authors, writes a book called Resurrection. And in that book, there is a character who is a college professor. And he's seen as, you know, horrible and degenerate, as most of your professors probably are. I know that's how my students see me. But this degenerate also slept with his students. And the worst thing is he slept with both male and female students. Oh my goodness. He comes, of course, to a fiery and painful end and is miserable. And it's another way of Tolstoy, sort of the moral voice of the period, following this sort of homophobic legacy, if you will. On the flip side, and this is, again, how things get complicated, a very well-respected author, Kuzmin, writes another novel that outsells Resurrection, which really drove Tolstoy nuts, called Wings, that is all about a same-sex couple who are portrayed very, very positively and with great sympathy. And this catches the imagination of the intelligentsia at the time and becomes very, very popular. Think about Kuzmin as sort of the director of the Will and Grace series of his time, right? So things are gloomy, but there are signs of hope. It's a conflicted time. And then comes the revolution. One of the things that the revolution accomplishes in 1917 is it inadvertently, and I love that word, and it is the word in the Russian history books as well as the English. The revolution inadvertently legalizes same-sex relationships. Inadvertently, just because they pass a law saying all of these statutes are now, you know, gone from the evil imperial period, and that included Article 995. And there's some discussion that later people were like, we should have taken that one out, but it was too late. Inadvertent legalization. In the 20s, things start to change. Same-sex relationships among women were categorized as a psychological illness, something that needed to be treated, differentiated form of hysteria. It starts in the 20s and it really gains momentum. By the 50s, it is adopted by the Soviet Psychiatric Association, and it means that the Soviet Psychiatric Association is no longer invited to any international conferences. And they get kind of excluded. It's not until 1934 that they get around to reinstitutionalizing something that looks very, very much like Article 995. So again, same-sex relationships between men now are illegal. And the term, the srok, as we say in Russian, is up to 8 years. A lot of this reflects the confusion about sex and the state in revolutionary Russia. And this is a great period if you're interested in sexuality and sexuality studies, because weird stuff was going on. Some of it will sound strikingly familiar, some of it may really surprise you. Many of you perhaps have already heard this phrase, "У нас секса нет." We have no sex in the Soviet Union, which was the tagline that came out of a video link-up during the early Brezhnev period between Phil Donahue, ask your grandmother, talk show host, and Vladimir Posner, who was the Phil Donahue of Russia. And so they hooked the audiences up, and this was during the Cold War, and it was maybe the first time Russians and Americans got to talk to each other. And one of the questions, the Americans, of course, this was, you know, the late 70s, the Americans were all talking about sex, and there was a rather matronly woman from Moscow who stood up in the Russian audience and said, "We don't have sex in the Soviet Union," which led to an enormous amount of laughter as well as some questions about where all the little comrades came from. But still, it was this idea that, hey, you know, no, we don't have sex. We have a sexless society. And that's just not true, right? In the imperial period, prostitution was a boom industry in the Russian Empire. Lori Bernstein has written about this in her book about Sonia's daughters. Yellow tickets were the licenses that prostitutes in Moscow and St. Petersburg were obliged to get. They had to go get it checked for syphilis once a month, and if they were clean, they got a yellow ticket. Now I'm thinking if you were not a risk taker, you want to go to the commercial sex workers at the beginning of the month as opposed to the end, but that's a whole nother lecture. But this was a law from the Ministry of Health. Can you imagine our Surgeon General coming out with something like this? I don't know, but I think I'd pay to see it. After 1917, prostitution is kind of demonized, and they try to stamp it out, right? It's the poisonous flower of the bourgeois way of life. We have to get rid of it. And the idea that women should not have to sell their bodies is really important. And a huge advocate of this, who was really important revolutionary in the Russian Revolution, she's a woman, so she gets written out of the historical record far too often, was Alexandra Kollontai. And this woman was something, right? Kollontai is incredibly charismatic. She could give talks to groups of 5,000 workers and get them all to walk out of the factory and to join the Bolshevik Party. She was astounding. She also had some very, very forward-thinking, in my opinion, views on gender and sexuality. She's very famous for this very obnoxious spat that she had with Lenin, where she was giving a talk in front of a textile factory audience, primarily female, and she said, I don't understand why these people, why the bourgeois are so caught up about sex. Sex is just biological, right? People should come together and have union without any sort of folderol and presumptuousness. If you're thirsty, you drink water. If you are so inclined, you should have sex. This was pretty hot stuff for 1920, right? Kollontai, female, popular, charismatic. Three things Lenin was not. was not referred to by name, but a mere 6 days after this huge successful rally that would have put any Trump rally to shame, after this huge successful rally, 6 days later, in Pravda, front page. Well, yes, comrades, we must be afraid of excesses, writes Lenin. There are those who would say, you know, having sex is just a biological need and no more problematic to fulfill than drinking water when one is thirsty. But let us remember, dear comrades, no one likes to drink from a dirty, greasy glass. Yeah. Funny how things go around, right? You can fill in your own political quote there about women as you wish. But the thing is that sexual repression after Kollontai, who for all of her efforts, do you know what her prize was? Ambassador to Norway. Because, you know, she's charismatic, she's female, she speaks her mind. Get her out of the country now, right? So, Alexandra is banished. Off she goes to fulfill her diplomatic duties. While at home, sexual repression gets started again. So, Kollontai's gone, glass of water theory's over. Now we lock women up for having unnatural sexual orientation. And by the 30s, we have now instituted massive criminal fines for men who are engaged in same-sex activities. And it becomes really strange. There was this thing right after the revolution, and it went on until the end of the Soviet Union, called the Komsomol. Does anyone know what that is? What's Komsomol?
I don't think I do anymore. No, I don't want to say it out loud.
That's okay.
Say it. No, I don't know.
No pressure in my talks. The Komsomol was a junior communist league.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
We'll talk later. Women usually know the right answer, and then they do, oh, I don't want to say it. No, we'll slap that right out of
I
it.
saw the Komsomol 12 Commandments, and I was like,
The Komsomol had 12 commandments, right? I mean, hey, Moses only had 10. Komsomol had 12, right? This was from a book for all good young communists. You want to get ahead after the revolution? You want to be part of Lenin's team, right? You want to avoid the Stalinist purges? You join the Komsomol. And in the Komsomol, they had these 12 commandments about how to be a good Komsomol leader. And again, surprise, surprise, 80% of the Komsomol leaders, of course, were ethnic Russians, male. They all kind of looked alike. It was a little scary, right? But in their 12 commandment books, which is top reading if you ever need a translation for your Russian language class, the sex act must not be repeated too often. Right? Which is, again, exactly what I would do if I wanted to recruit a lot of 20-year-old men to my organization. Right? Love must be monogamous. Okay? The sex object, that's so romantic. The sex object must not be changed frequently. I sat in the archives staring at that for hours and I still don't know what that means. Right? I think it means you shouldn't sleep around. Goodness knows. And I could tell many off-color jokes about this, but I won't. So I'll go on, because there's more slides to go on. But this is the new Communist Party, right? Forget Colin Pye. We don't want any of that stuff, right? The sexual act must not be seen as something shameful and sinful, but something natural, right? Colin Pye's gone. We ship her off to Scandinavia. And we encourage the comfortable, right? So we're definitely coming into this period that sets up that comment from that fine woman in Moscow. We have no sex in the Soviet Union. And so I want you to think about how that kind of history might provide what I would call a state socialist hangover. Everybody says legacy. I get tired of it. It's a hangover, right? Head kind of hurts. You're not quite up to snuff, right? And it is old school, sort of crazy communism period stuff. Like, you guys are too young, but the professors find this funny, right? The wildly crazy guys from Saturday Night Live. Leading scholars of sex and sexuality in Russia, Igor Kohn, right, calls this period, right, it's a time of repression, denial, and silence. Sex was something to be carefully negotiated and kept under wraps, right? You just didn't talk about it. Anna Tchomkina in St. Petersburg argues that sexual expression, like political expression, was highly regulated, right? Outlets were found, but sexual publics, just like political publics, never cropped up, right? So there wasn't a big LGBTQ community. There wasn't a feminist movement. There weren't these either political or sexual publics during the Soviet period. And as a result, we have ridiculously low levels of sexual health knowledge. We have extremely low levels of contraceptive use, right, and contraceptive access. Right? And relatively, when you compare it to Western Europe, and yes, even the United States, very high rates of STDs. Syphilis and gonorrhea in particular. So one article that I came across in this research was from Krasnaya Zvezda, the Red Star Army Journal, and it was saying that among troops in Vladivostok, I don't know what's going on out there, but that 30% of them in 1995 had to be treated for either syphilis or gonorrhea. 30% is pretty high, right? And a lot of this is linked to a lack of information, a lack of discussion, and maybe a denial of the fact that whether the Commonwealth tells you you can or not, people have sex. And I think you can see this really clearly if you think about the post-communist world and their attitudes towards same-sex relationships. So this is from the European Social Survey, and this data comes from 2010, which is the first time they asked this unbelievably forward-thinking question. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Gays and lesbians should live as they wish to. Right? This is a pretty low-level tolerance measure, right? So this is a percent of the nationally representative sample in each one of these European countries that said, yes, people should live as they wish to. That's pretty minimal, right, in terms of support, right? This is not exactly a big pride parade thing. But where are the post-socialist countries? They are the least tolerant. And as you can see in the Russian Federation, less than 37% of the population would even just say people should be allowed to live as they wish. No, they shouldn't. And you'll see that there's kind of almost a rainbow curtain, right, that goes across. It's not an iron curtain. Everybody in Western Europe has fairly high levels of acceptance of that basic statement, where everybody in Eastern Europe or the former Soviet world is really low. In the post-Soviet period, just like in the imperial period and in the revolutionary period, we see the emergence of a lot of conflicting developments in terms of respect for human rights and respect for all people regardless of sexual orientation or practices. In the Yeltsin period, in 1993, when he comes in, Article 121 gets repealed. And it is repealed by 80% of the Duma, right? So none of this 50-50, have the vice president come in and split the difference. This was overwhelmingly, it's like, we cannot have this. We got to get rid of it. So now, all of a sudden, it's no longer a criminal offense for same-sex relationships. Ladies, I'm sure this is of no shock to you. It took them another 6 years to destigmatize same-sex relationships or orientations among women. So it's taken out of the psychiatric list in 1999. So revolutions in 1991, the Soviet Union collapses, they got right on it, right? We'll get to it. It took a while. If at the same time you think that Russia's kind of dragging their feet, I just want to point out that it wasn't until 1990, which is not that long ago. I know it seems like it to you guys, but it really wasn't. In 1990, that is how long it took the international psychiatric community to take being a lesbian out of the list of psychiatric disorders. So in that kind of context, Russia isn't that far back. Great NGO development during the Yeltsin era. The Ministry of Health, concerned about sexual health, and this is the 90s, concerned about the spread of HIV and AIDS, welcomed the World Health Organization and other practitioners who came in to help foster NGO groups to increase sexual education, to provide more inclusive appreciation of people's sexual human rights. It was really a flowering period. Unfortunately, all of those organizations were completely paid for by Western donors. And so they didn't have really good grassroots in local communities in many situations. By the time Yeltsin goes out, we'll skip over Medvedev. We think about the Putin period. He wastes no time. Clearly channeling Peter the Great, which I think he thinks he can do. It's only about a 3-foot difference in their height. In 2003, he says, anyone of, and this is where he expands it. So, right, it's 2003. So we're not just going to say same-sex unions. Now he says anyone with alternative gender or sexual orientation. So he's being a little bit more inclusive here. I don't want any in my military. Now let's think about this. In 2003, Russian conscripts were incredibly rare. Everybody was getting out and going into the Russian army. Nobody wanted to go in. In 2003, Russian generals argued that they had at least a 25% deficit in the Muslim communities in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church, and Jewish synagogues in Russia. So all unite and start to argue against these. In this period, a lot of the NGOs that are dealing with human rights issues and focusing on issues of sexuality and sexual expression start to mysteriously get closed down. By 2009, when the Helsinki Report comes out, there are book burnings, primarily amongst religious groups, but also among government officials, especially out in the provinces, they would get as many copies of the report as they could, put them in a bonfire, and set them on fire. Guess there's not a lot of online reading. Okay. And by 2013, we get the horrible Article 6.21, right? Again, passed unanimously by the Duma and signed immediately by Putin. So when we think about this propaganda law, it didn't come out of nowhere, right? This is a long, cyclical, historical trend that occurs in the Russian Federation. And And one of the things that I want you to think about is the way in which this gets pitched in the Putin era. Because it's not about sex. I would argue because I think Putin really does believe there is no sex in the Russian Federation. Well, I guess we can't say that because evidently he has several mistresses. But still, it's not about sex. What's the one thing that's going to get your heart, that's going to make you worry, that's going to make you say, well, maybe he knows what he's doing? It's all about the children, right? So, the current restrictions, he argues, as well as members of his cabinet, are not about sex. They're about protecting children, right? So Yelena Nizulina, she is a trip and a half, who is the Duma head of the Committee on Families, Women, and Children. And this is from the Just Russia Party. We Russians treasure our children, because clearly nobody else does, right? We Russians treasure our children, and this law is simply one of many needed to protect them and allow for their normal development. So we're not being homophobic, we're being pro-child. And it's not just about the fact it's not about sex, it's about children. The religious community jumps in and says, you know what? It's not about sex, it's about the West. It's about those people over there who are trying to diminish Mother Russia, right? Europe as Sodom and Gomorrah. No need to point to Europe as we live. Let them live as they want. But we do not need to specify it. And if talks on visa-free space due to the fact that our streets should march gay pride parades, I am categorically against such international relations. That's right. Cut off our visas. Do what you want. But all of that gay pride stuff, all of that stuff about sexual human rights, that's Western. We don't want that. It goes against who we are, right? So again, nothing to do with sex, it has to do with the delegitimate West that's coming in to take your Russian soul. So as the patriarch of the Orthodox Church argued, other countries are legislating sin. We don't do that. We can't. This is a very dangerous apocalyptic symptom. Right? Doesn't get much worse than that. We must do everything in our powers to ensure that sin is never sanctioned in Russia by state law, because that would mean that the nation has embarked on a path of self-destruction. And ladies, if you think that, oh, this is about sexual minorities, it is not. Because remember, he's talking about the law that says you can't have sex unless it's for procreation. This is coming out at the same time Putin is pushing his mother's capital pro-natalist policies to encourage births, right? Because the Russian population is shrinking. If they could outlaw contraception, I think they would. And this is exactly the same time when UNFPA and a lot of other international organizations focusing on reproductive health are quietly asked to leave Russia, because Russia is no longer a recipient of international aid. They are a donor nation, thank you very much. This is when UNAIDS is asked very politely to cut their staff down to 2 people. This is when the UN Fund for Population Activities is invited to discontinue their efforts on sexual education, because they want sex only for procreation. We didn't get it, right? I didn't either. Because we kept saying, but this is about human rights, right? It is about human rights. President Obama on Jay Leno, lest you think I do all my research in the archives. Sometimes, you know, right? President Obama comes up and says, this is about human rights, right? In a wonderful op-ed in the New York Times, Harvey Fierstein writes this wonderful thing about this is a war, not just against people of alternative sexual orientations. This is a war against all human rights, and we need to think about it. The West also, this isn't about sex, right? But to a certain extent, it kind of is. What we find in 2013 to 2016, this is a content analysis of some Russian journals, major Russian journals, and TV programs, and major Western TV journals and news programs. And so I came up with, and I'm blanking, how many? 364 articles that then I coded. What are the big themes that come up, right? Human rights. Russia is the light blue, hardly ever mentioned. In the West, it's all we ever talk about. Sin, it's all the Russian press. Children, the West does not mention children in this, right? Doesn't make any sense, but it's all about the kids for Russia. Violence, protection, Western threat, and then very few articles about sex, right? Overall, I got almost 400 articles. You'd think some of them would mention sex, right? No, this isn't about sex. It's about what the West thinks is human rights, and it's about what Russia wants to portray in terms of child protection, in terms of protecting itself from the West, and in terms of morality and sin. And so after thinking about this, I kept seeing all these reports from my colleagues at the Levada Center when they still were functioning and doing survey research in Russia. And so I really started thinking, do public attitudes vary in Russia towards gays and lesbians? Is everybody against this, or is there some variation? Because if we think back to the not so recent past in the United States, we also were a fairly intolerant society. And things changed rapidly. Things changed rapidly in Western Europe. Things changed really rapidly in a span of 5 years in Ireland when they adopted same-sex marriage. One of the theories that sociologists like to talk about is that when you look at the bottom up, there are influencers in society. These are people who are early adapters to new human rights approaches. These are people who will spread their ideas throughout the community and really make it worthwhile. And there are specific characteristics that either encourage your position as an early adapter or make someone suspicious that maybe you might be a force against increasing tolerance, right? And so here are some of the big things from the literature in terms of LGBTQ attitudes in public opinion. Religion in Western Europe and North America, highly religious people seem to be more intolerant towards a variety of sexual orientations. Gender, interestingly, women tend to report more tolerance, right? And this is linked into gender theory simply because women were also much more likely to report they knew someone who had an alternative sexual or gender orientation. Education. Higher your education, the more tolerant, the more supportive of human rights you are. In terms of media, the kind of media you support, I'll leave it up to you which channel you think would predict tolerance or less tolerance in the Western context. And then networks, people who knew a lot of people, right? And this is all about the sociological contact hypothesis, which is the idea that we can hold in our head a negative idea of a certain group or a certain behavior because it's abstract. Once we meet someone and we see that they have 2 arms, 2 legs, kids, grass to mow, all sorts of concerns we share, our tolerance and our acceptance rates go up. And that's why when you live in segregated societies, you often find higher levels of intolerance, right? So if your network is big, the idea is you probably know people who have a variety of sexual orientations. We all do. And if we were more open about this, contact hypothesis says we would increase our tolerance, right? So what happens when we look for Russia? Well, this happens in almost all social science analyses of the Russian Federation. All of these theories that we have on the West don't always work, right? So I will say, in the Russian Federation, we still have well over a third of the population who tends to be very supportive of the rights of sexual minorities. That's not nothing. That's pretty good, especially given all these messages from above. It's pretty impressive. But who is more likely to not be tolerant? So basically, who's against the statement, having gays and lesbians live as they wish, is either a bad or a very bad thing? Okay? We flip it on the head. What we find in the European Social Survey for 2014, and these are preliminary results, is that people who were very religious, unlike the West, are way more likely to be tolerant. If they go to church, if they pray, if they think of religion as central in their life, they are more tolerant. Absolutely the opposite of what we found in Europe. Youth let us down. In the US, many would argue that it was youth that really pushed the Same-Sex Marriage Act. It was youth that really showed society the way for a more tolerant future. In the Russian situation, for people under the age of 30, if I control for education and religiosity, they are twice as likely to be very intolerant. Not exactly a shining example for our future, right? So youth seems to be very susceptible to these anti-human rights messages. Women are only slightly more likely to be intolerant. And surprise, surprise, if you pitch it as protecting children, does it surprise you that in Russia, women are more likely to stigmatize the population? Seems to make sense for me. They face a 25% increased odds. People with higher education are 50% more likely to disagree with just basic existence rights. And then lastly, if people use the internet at least once a week, they are 2.5 times more likely to say, no, gays and lesbians should not live as they wish. This is the flipped mirror image of what we found when acceptance was low in North America and Western Europe. And so as we move forward, and I do think things will change in the Russian Federation, and that over a third that is more tolerant grows, we'll be looking at a very different pattern of influencers. And I think it gives us a really interesting idea about how does government policy influence public opinion, and then how, in essence, do political pushes to stigmatize a group, to demonize a group, how do they write themselves on the public opinion of a diverse population? Because it doesn't affect everybody the same. And so I want you to consider thinking about who's susceptible and who's resistant and resilient. And that's, I'll end it there. I'm sorry I went on so long. You guys look really tired. But thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Questions?
Yes?
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask, what's the political context for the 2003 military measure under Putin? And where did that come from? Was that kind of the central part of his agenda, or was it the military that was pushing that, or, you know, did suddenly a lot of non-conventional people appear in the military? What was going on there?
So in 2003, for those of you who you guys are too young, but for the three of us who are old enough to remember things in 2003. So during that period, this was a time of high scandal in the military. This is when a lot of reports about the beating of new recruits and the regime of punishment and exploitation that was generated by generals in the Russian army was at its apex, right? So filled with scandals. Soldiers starved to death, beaten to death. It was awful. Authoritarian-esque leaders like to employ distraction, right? And so if you are faced with a media that's talking about all these scandals in your military, and it was horrifying, this was a great thing to pull out and say, oh yeah, we've got to crack down and improve our military. The first thing we have to do is to make sure that people of alternative gender orientation or sexual orientation can't serve. And so it deflected from the horrible beatings that were being taken place, especially in the Siberian areas, and deflected it to something else. There was no indication that there were any issues whatsoever. It was just a distraction. Yeah.
I wanted to go way back to Peter the Great, sort of those first couple of anti-LGBT, I guess, laws going on in Russia. What's going on prior to that? Like, is it something that's culturally unacceptable, but it's not codified in the law yet, or is there more tolerance previously, and something happens where, like, that's same-sex relationships, or like the idea of it changes, or?
Well, so before Peter starts to enact these laws, you have religious authority saying that, you know, damning such behaviors, and it's really focused on the MSM community. I think they just, you know, women just weren't written in a lot of Russian history at that point. And so you still have religious authority. You have the patriarchs coming out with missives saying that such people are not allowed in church, they can't be buried on consecrated ground, etc., etc. But it's not taken up by the state as some sort of legal statute.
Is there some kind of reason why the state?
That's a really great question, and I don't know. But it's a wonderful question. I think you would probably need a historian with a little bit more tolerance for the archives to figure that out. But there aren't a lot of records in that period. But I myself have done as much secondary reading as I can, and I haven't seen any talks about the laws. Most people trace it to Peter at that point. And now it could be that if you look in, say, the residency permits for cities and stuff, there might be some mention. But that's a great question. I'll have to do some more research on it. Thank you very much.
So how influential is religion in the life of the average Russian citizen, and then how influential is it in the world of Russian politics? And do those things cross over at all? Is it very heavily pushing this agenda for its own gain, or is it just kind of a byproduct of its existence?
That's a wonderful question, and I will answer, and I don't mean to sound flippant, but I will answer with European Social Survey and Russian Longitudinal Monitoring Survey data. The Russian Longitudinal Monitoring Survey in 2012, because I'm working on a different paper with this, that while 97% of ethnic and linguistic Russians identify as Russian Orthodox. Of that group, approximately 30% also later on in the questionnaire say they don't believe in God. And the last I checked, that was kind of a minimum assumption. So, and I'm not joking, and it's not that faith is not really important, and it provides incredible solace to a lot of people, and it can play an amazing role for good, for sure. But it's simply that it's much more of a cultural orientation for some people. And that's why in my work, I try to look at religiosity. Don't tell me, this is coming from a big Irish Catholic family with a lot of priests and nuns, and it's like, yeah, don't tell me what you are. Tell me when was the last time you went to confession? When was the last time you went to church? So we need to measure religiosity. Religiosity is growing. It's still continuing to grow. And what's interesting is it didn't really take off among the youth for a long time, and it seems to be creeping up among the youth too. So I would just encourage you to think too, it's not just who you're affiliated with, but how much you incorporate that into your day-to-day life. Because if I just put in, religious identity, I would get a very different figure. When I say, you know, do you say religion is a daily factor in your life? Do you practice? Do you go to services? And I come up with a religiosity measure. Those people are really harmed. So it's more complicated. So the Russian Orthodox Church is highly political. It's very symbolically powerful. I don't think America will ever, in the near future, will probably elect an atheist, right? But it's symbolically powerful. Putin is always at services on Easter and Christmas, and it's always televised, much like many leaders in Western Europe and North America. How politically potent the church is still unclear. I will say that the patriarch was able to pull the religious identity question off of the Russian census in 2010 because he didn't want to know how big the Muslim population was. And he was like, we should ask them what religion they adhere to. No, the patriarch said, get that out. And they took it off the census questionnaire. So that seems pretty politically powerful to me. Is that good?
Yeah, there are Mark Palmer, I worked on Soviet and religiosity post-Soviet period. There was ostensibly a rise in Orthodox belief, or at least people who identified or claimed to identify as Orthodox. But when they examined who went to the church, it was extremely low. It's sort of like the survey that came out. Remember, this was 80% of the population supports Putin, right? There wasn't. Did you see the article? Well, this woman, a commentator, pointed out that, well, yeah, they're in Saratov or Tsaritsyn, and they're watching the television, and so they're asked about, you know, do you support our government? Oh, yes, I support our government. It doesn't mean that they're supporting Putin in the concrete way. It's just a way that they get along. They really don't care.
Do you love America?
Yeah, sort of like that.
Yeah.
But I did have to disagree.
Oh, please.
I was in St. Petersburg for 2 months in the summer of 2015. They have stores explicitly selling contraceptives everywhere. Is St. Petersburg different? I just wonder.
Yeah. So St. Petersburg is different. You can get some crazy condoms in St. Petersburg. They have like little animals on. It's amazing.
Well, the other thing is that you get European ones too.
Yeah. And so no, you can buy condoms. You can still buy condoms in Moscow. But St. Petersburg, first of all, is somewhat unique because it is the epicenter of the HIV epidemic in the Russian Federation. And so condom access is really important. St. Petersburg was also when it had a brief, ill-fated, but still tried to have a needle exchange program because they have such a high rate of HIV transmission through intravenous drugs. And so no, you can get contraception in Russia. It is not, if you go out to say Western Siberia, you are not going to see a lot of UNA or foreign-run sex education classes. So thank you for clarifying that for me. You're absolutely right. So you can find the kiosks with condoms, and even out in the villages you can find some condoms. But you're not going to find any injectables. You're not going to have a lot of choice, and it's not going to be as easy to get as people had hoped. But thank you for that correction.
There's another thing to think about from this. Think about the 19th century socialists in Europe. They were based on all prudes.
Yeah, the 19th century socialists in Europe were kind of all.
Engels,
Rosa wasn't so bad.
No?
Rosa?
Of Debs.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, so, there's that the journal of totalitarianisms and secular religions. And so, Marxism is partly socialist, but it also has a religious component. And the way these people dealt with it in the Soviet Union was religious, right? And so it's just that this prudishness persists across the religious boundaries.
Yeah. Even when Colin Ty tries to give them a way out.
Yeah.
It's not going to work. Yeah, no, it is, yeah, not a lot of bodice gripper novels being put out, not a lot of libertine behavior. You're right, that's a great point. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Sir?
Why do you think like there is such a difference in the attitudes of like the very religious between Russia and here, especially given that there's like such unified support of like the churches against gay and lesbian rights? Like,
Yeah, but again, there's lots of variation amongst the very religious in the United States as well, and it depends on sect, it depends on time, right? Took him a while, but new pope came around, right? It's hard to know, so I think you've asked a brilliant question. The thing that gets me is that I went for the very religious. So these are people who are devout. And they read their Bible, and they go to services, and they say religion is a daily part of their life. This is not the majority of the people who answered the survey, right? So it's about 17%. And in that group of people who are highly religious, not affiliated with something, but really live it, they are way more tolerant. And what's interesting is I have similar survey data for Central Asia, who has mimicked some of these sex laws in their countries, and I find the same thing. So they're primarily Muslim, but if they practice and they pray and they are devout, they are way more likely to say, yeah, God, you know, it's fine.
Do you have any idea why?
I think that there's two potential pathways, and this is really preliminary, so please excuse me. In the Central Asian case, I think it's simply that, again, they are thinking about their faith as a lived experience and inclusion, and they also see being a religious Muslim in Central Asia is hard too, and there are restrictions placed on you. So it may be sort of that fellow minority idea that they're more tolerant because they know what it's like to be persecuted. It could also be that, as many Islamic scholars have argued, and I am not an Islamic scholar, but the specificity of homophobia within the religion is highly questioned by a lot of religious scholars. And so it could be that those who really devote themselves to living the life are less likely to be swayed with fire and brimstone discussions and selective interpretations of passages. I'm not sure. I just don't
Are the
know.
Orthodox the same way, you think?
Yeah. I do think so. That could be wrong. It's just a working hypothesis for now. But it is kind of weird, isn't it?
To your knowledge, I was reading a National Geographic article about youth in Russia, and how they are so extremely different from older generations because they've gone through such different things. To your knowledge, do the youth in Russia feel very different about issues such as LGBT rights than like their parents, their grandparents, or is it about the same across the generation?
Well, think about your last family dinner at a holiday. And let's do this. Grandma and Grandpa are all for LGBT rights. And Junior is like, oh no, that's got to be punishable by law. Would that kind of be weird, or is that your, I don't want to get too personal, but is that anyone's typical experience? Don't hurt yourself, you're shaking your head too hard. It's not what you would typically expect. But increasingly, this is the generational split. In terms of social attitudes and attitudes towards human rights, we're finding that once you control for education and you control for gender and religiosity, youth are really conservative. Now, this may be waning as the regime is unable to make good on promises of social mobility in the future, as youth who are increasingly globalized, right, may change opinions. But there was also, and I ran an interaction in this model, I don't want to get too mathy on you, I'm sorry, but youth spend more time on the internet too, right? And we think of the internet as this place of freedom. This is not the case if you go on Russian social media. This is not the case if you use the internet to get your information. You're much more likely to get it from official sources that are pushing the state agenda. And so there might be something there as well.
Would you say
She was
that
shaking her head so hard I have to answer.
this is a theoretical question. Based on like the religious practices of the United States versus other, like let's say the Asian and the Orthodox communities, based on the, I guess, the rigidity of faith, where here interpretation even in your Protestant communities is less varied, and it's more of a I take it in and I spit it out versus a I take it in, I think of it, and I apply it to my life sort of thing. Would you say that in the Orthodox and Asian communities that is more widely used versus the American religious spread?
That's a great question, and I have to admit I don't know the answer.
Because that could affect how the view of LGBTQ, even just tolerance of it existing.
Yeah, well, I think you've got a really smart point there, and I really appreciate the question, because I think that in these cultures, everybody's religious, everybody has a religious affiliation, but think about your own context, right? How much do you toe the line? How many Saturday services or Sunday services or Friday services have you missed in the last 2 months? How many times have you done your daily devotionals? How much time have you spent looking at holy texts? That's a different sort of thing, and maybe people who do that, especially young people who do that, are more reflexive, as you were saying. That makes a lot of sense. I really appreciate your comment. Thanks. Okay. That's okay.
Can you talk a little bit about I turned it off. Let's do it. Oh, she turned it off.
So thanks for telling me now.
It was making too much.
I was squeaking. Okay.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the repression and the camps that are happening right now in Chechnya?
We talked about this at lunch with some of your colleagues, and they had really smart things to say. And so, of course, we've heard that there are very violent re-education camps that are operating in Chechnya, again, targeting the MSM community, where they will rehabilitate, because as Kadyrov says, you can't be Chechen and not be a man. So, you know, those times you want to tap them on the shoulder and say, you know what you just said is stupid, right? but no one does that, probably because they'd be killed, so I guess that makes sense. In the Chechen case, and again, let's not over-orientalize this, we have plenty of political figures in the United States who have advocated conversion therapy. One of them happens to be Vice President, right? Okay, so it is not off the charts. Now, I'm not saying that Vice President Pence would be violent and murder people. I'm just saying things are, you can say that, I cannot. But I think that we need to put it in context, right? So it's not crazy, out of the world, no one ever thought of it. It would only happen in Chechnya. But what I would argue is that Putin is in a rough position, because he has opened the bottle with the monsters in it. And the monsters have come out and they help with keeping minorities in their place. And they help with, stop me when this sounds familiar, harassing illegal, unregistered alien migrants. And they help with harassing the LGBTQ community. And those are all things that work for his agenda. But the problem is that once the monsters get out of the bottle, it's hard to put the monsters back in. And so in the Chechen case, Kadyrov has a long tenure of going off the ranch, so to speak, in terms of his own political agenda. And this is yet one more situation. What is horrific is that Helsinki, Human Rights Watch, as well as Memorial, have documented these cases. They have documented these cases of people being murdered. and Putin will not denounce him. And that is a question for a different head of state. But at the same time, remember, these are steps along a continuum, and Putin may be closer to the idea of what Kadyrov is supporting in Chechnya than he would be towards what Human Rights Watch and Helsinki Freedom Group would want him to adopt. So it's a difficult balancing act. The last press report that I read was 5 days ago in Krasnodar, and that these re-education camps are increasing, and now the Cossacks are getting involved. And so there are 2 camps that have been opened outside of Krasnodar in the south, and we'll see what happens. It's a very, very troubling situation. Thanks. That's great.
I just want to make sure that I'm interpreting this correctly. So the primary difference between the very religious, the practicing religious people, and then the people who claim to be affiliated with a specific sect, is it sort of like here where people can say that they belong to a specific sect, but it's not necessarily about religion at all. It's more of like a nationalistic kind of thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's an identity, right? Where they join for the book club.
Right.
Should we let Hunter, because he had to do the camera.
I had a question about Russian media.
Yeah.
Are there any characters in TV shows or movies or literature that are like non-gender conforming or LGBTQ, or like is there representation in media?
That's a great question. So those of you who have traveled to Russia know that they are inveterate consumers of American TV and Law and Order 24/7, just like here.
Just like here.
Great, just like here. There was, back when there were independent TV stations, there were beginning negotiations to put Wool and Grace on Russian TV. I would have paid money to see that happen. I think it would have been great. But Minister of Communications cut it down, so that could not be shown. And that is not shown. There have been viewings of a lot of Larry Kramer's movies, The Normal Heart, also Angels in America. The trilogy has been shown on Russian TV, and it's available on DVD. So there are some outlets, but very rare, and not as a commercial ongoing series or ongoing character. It has gotten so bad that sometimes you trip over who you're trying to hate the most. And this show is now off the air, but it was part of my work on migration. But there was this TV show with 2 comedians who were always pretending to be Tajik migrants, unregistered Tajik migrants, and brilliant, right? Because they would always act like, oh, they didn't speak Russian, they couldn't understand, and it was, they would get into these crazy messes. And then at the end of the show, when all the Russians were away, the one guy who seemed to be just marginally verbal and intelligent would start quoting French philosophy about what had happened, and then retell the story in an incredibly intellectually engaged way. It was a wonderful little TV show, but they had one episode about men having sex with men in a Russian banya, and they were never allowed to air it. So it's like, we like it when you make fun of migrants, but you can't do that. So sometimes you got to prioritize who you're going after, who you're stigmatizing, I guess. So it's a great question, but again, most people have seen a lot of films that do have good and positive depictions of same-sex relationships and gender-curious relationships that are great, but they're got to get the DVD.
How much of the things that are going on, like the policies being made, like how much would you say is it like fear of like going against what the government is saying, and how much of it is like actual belief? Like how many people this is actually wrong, or like just the people that are like, oh, we're okay with it, but I'm not gonna say anything because I'm not supposed to.
So what I want to believe, because I think you need to be an optimist, right? You got 3 more years, buddy. You got to be optimist. You got to be an optimist. I'm thinking that a lot of, not all, but a lot of the homophobia is mile wide and an inch deep, right? I do believe in the contact hypothesis. I do believe that the Levada Center, who published, and I still can't believe they published this, they said that only 5% of Russians know someone who is in the LGBTQ community. That's not true. I think 5% of Russians know someone who is out in the LGBTQ community, but everybody knows somebody, right? And so one of the more chilling things about these laws is it makes it very, very dangerous to be out. And therefore, you don't get that contact hypothesis. You don't get that destigmatization. And so in a weird sort of way, it's cruelly effective. I don't know. You know, it's hard to, there haven't been any studies about the depth of homophobia. I will say that this is a very challenging time for human rights in many countries. And it behooves all of us as global citizens to remember that, you know, just because forces that you don't like come for one group doesn't mean they're going to come for you next. And I think that's something that's not just applicable in Russia. I think that's applicable almost everywhere. But your question's a great one. I wish I knew.
So let's take one more question.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Do you know if anything is like, because you had the chart that showed like every country that was in the.
You want to go back to that? Yeah.
So Union was also.
Well, the Eastern Europe.
Eastern Europe, yeah.
Nobody likes my rainbow curtain thing, so I got to drop that. But I thought it was really kind of cool. Iron curtain. But yeah, Slovenia, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Estonia, Croatia, Ukraine, Lithuania, Russia. Yep.
I wondered, since there's also a lot of Russian involvement in Ukraine right now, if there's like anything horrible happening in Ukraine right now that has to do with LGBT, because that's where a lot of my ancestry is. When I saw that up there, it's like, oh God.
Well, you're lucky to be at a university where you have one of the world's best experts on Ukraine with Professor Heron here. So I'm a little intimidated to try and answer this, but I will say from my work on UNAIDS, there is something really horrifying. Both Russia and Ukraine have generalized HIV epidemics. And one of the things that's happened with the dislocation with incursions into the Donbass is that people don't get their ARVs. And people can't get their doctor's appointments, right? They've got to register someplace else. And not to bore you guys with the biology of it, but if you are HIV positive and you're on antiretrovirals and you're good about taking them, your viral load can go undetectable. You're great. But as soon as you stop, those little microbes go whee, and your viral load will spike. So it's not just like, oh, I forgot to take my vitamin today. It's a much more serious sort of thing. And so because UNAIDS is not allowed in the area not firmly controlled by the Ukrainian government, there is a lot of concern because there are not supplies of antiretrovirals going in because Russia doesn't accept aid from UNAIDS. And a lot of the medical clinics are no longer working. So it becomes problematic. And for me, it's not just an LGBTQ question, it's a human rights question, it's a public health question that is really highly problematic. And it's something that I'm grateful for the NGOs that are on the ground that are affiliated with the LGBTQ community have been in the forefront of trying to push for making sure that people can get their medicines. Because that's something that doesn't always happen when you have massive dislocation of population.
So please join us in thanking Professor Buckley. Thank you, Cindy. Join us for future events. Collect all the buttons.
Collect all the buttons, collect the flyers,
yeah.
sign in if you didn't already.
And Cindy will be here if you have questions to follow up afterwards. Thank you again.
Thanks, guys.